Back in the year 2000, a game called Deus Ex was released, which changed the gaming industry forever. Except it didn't, because developers spent the next 10 years completely ignoring it. But that's not important right now, because this week Eidos releases Deus Ex Human Revolution for PlayStation, PC and Xbox. Now, one of the cool effects in Deus Ex is the ability to turn yourself invisible. This is particularly useful if you're rolling past a room full of heavily armed guards. So, how do you create this effect in HitFilm? Okay, so here we have a slightly different version of the effect from the one you just saw, but the same techniques apply. As you can see, we've got a displacement on me here, which is creating the kind of wibbly cloaking style effect. Then we've got a bunch of different layers for the actual invisibility itself. So as I turn invisible, there's all sorts of interesting things going on here. So let's go from the start and see how this is built up. Here we have our green screen layer, which is fairly standard. And the first thing we need to do is isolate me from the background. So to do this, we'll use our standard color difference key. Drag that on, you can see the green screen immediately is removed, but we probably want to do a little bit of tweaking, so let's just take a quick look here. We'll just lower the max value a little bit there, so there's a bit more detail around me. And of course we don't want these two side parts here, which is where the green screen wasn't found. So we'll take our square mask tool, select the layer, and draw a nice simple square mask around me there. If we now turn off the matte, you can see that I'm nicely isolated. We'll throw on a quick spill removal filter just to remove any lingering green spill on me. And there we go, we have a nice isolated version of me. Now, depending on how you're shooting your invisibility sequence, you might have to use slightly different techniques, but the main thing is that you need an isolated version of your invisible subject. So here, nice and easy, we used green screen. In the video you saw of me on the sofa, I actually had to cut myself out using masking. It's a slightly longer process, but the general concept is the same. Okay, let's just rename this so that we can keep track of our layers. It's something that you should always do because it means you won't get lost in your composite shots. So we have our nice original clip here. Now I'm actually going to duplicate this, and then we'll take this one and we're going to turn this into a composite shot. We shall call this displacement source. And what we're going to do is take all the effects with the layer into the new composite shot. So you can see that in this new comp we have essentially the same thing. I'm actually going to stick a quick blur onto this now and jump back into our main composite. Just close that one down as well. So we now have our original and we have our displacement version. Let's put this underneath. We do of course need a background because you won't get the kind of wibbly cloaking effect without something to wibble onto. Those are the technical terms, by the way. We'll just take a random quick background image. Here we go, here's something. You can of course use anything you want. You can use a video or you can use an image. We'll just zoom this up a little bit and move him up here. There we go, that more or less works. It's a fairly simple composite, but that's not the point of this tutorial. So let's call this our background. Now if we turn off these top two layers, we can now add a displacement filter to the background. Just a standard effect, throw it on here. Nothing in particular happens straight away, but that's because we have to choose a source. So for this, we're of course going to choose the displacement source composite shot, which we've already embedded inside here. We'll actually choose the luminance channel for this. Okay, still not much going on here, so let's just boost up the strength of the effect. And there you go, you can see me starting to appear in a slightly displaced manner. Now how much you choose to use this depends on the particular effect you're going for. You can go for something really extreme or, not so extreme. But as the person moves around, you can see that it's displacing the background like that. Now you could of course stop there because that's the general effect that we're going for. But for this particular tutorial, let's do something a bit more interesting. So let's turn our original back on. And of course, to go from one to the other, it's a fairly simple process of opening up the original, turning on the opacity keyframes, moving forward slightly, and then dropping it down to 0%. And then as we scrub through those keyframes, you can see that I gradually disappear to reveal the displaced version underneath. Sometimes you can actually see the displaced version behind the original here, which obviously isn't what we want. So let's quickly jump to that first keyframe, And then we'll scroll down to the background where we applied the displacement, and we'll actually take the slice tool and cut it into two. And then on this first version, we'll turn off the displacement. And that means as soon as we hit the keyframes where the top layer starts to fade out, we switch to the displaced version of the background layer. Now of course when you're doing invisibility effects, the actual process of becoming invisible is entirely up to you. You know, the way it works here is completely acceptable, but you might want to add a bit more pizzazz to it. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So to create the grid layer, we're actually going to start a new composite shot, and we shall call it Grid Layer. Inside this, we're going to drag our displacement source composite, so that's nicely embedded there. We're now actually going to duplicate that, and then this top version we'll call Grid. And into this, we're going to add a whole bunch of effects. So to start with, we'll take the grid. That's not exactly what we're looking for, of course. On top of this, we're going to take another displacement effect, like we used on the background earlier. And then for this, we're going to select the other displacement source layer that we have in this comp. And again, we're going to set it to luminance. And then increase the displacement. And as you can see, where the person is, it's displacing the grid. Even as I move around, the grid is getting warped over the top of me. But of course we don't want the grid filling the entire frame like this. So let's take a set matte effect. We'll drop that on afterwards. And now we're going to set the source layer to the displacement source layer again. As you can see, this limits it just to the boundaries of the person. What we need to be careful of though is that although it looks like we've just got the grid, the actual holes in between the grid are still solid black. For example, if I change the background colour briefly to red, you can see that this is not transparent, and for the effect we want, we do need this to be transparent. So let's take another set matte effect, stick it on top, and then instead of choosing a layer, we're actually going to leave it as it is, but change this to luminance. And as you can see, that's now meant that only the bright areas of the grid are remaining. So we can see straight through to the displacement source layer beneath. If I turn this off, you can see that we just have the grid on its own. Now I'm just going to quickly change this back to black because we don't want a red background. To give this a bit more of a glow, we're going to use the neon glow effect. You've seen in previous tutorials, this is really good for creating the glow around a lightsaber, for example, but that doesn't stop you from using it for other purposes. You can see we've instantly, without much effort, got a nice glow going on. Let's just change the colour here, so a bit more of a kind of burnished gold look. And then we maybe want to just bring the expansion down so that it's more around the actual lines like that. Okay, so that's looking pretty good already. You can see as we move around we're getting a nice effect. We could probably do with actually tweaking the grid itself slightly, because we don't really have many lines going on here. So let's change this setting here to -25 in both cases. That just gives us slightly more lines going on. Now the last thing we're going to do is add a fisheye effect. This is a warp, so it's going to distort things quite a lot. We're going to add this between the grid and the displacement filter. So as you can see, as I move the fisheye warp around, it kind of warps the grid in really interesting ways. Depending on where I put it, creates different results. We're actually going to put it down towards the feet because that increases the detail at the top. So around the head, there's slightly more detail going on. The reason it had to go between the grid and displacement is that the order of effects is extremely important. For example, if we put it after the two set mattes, you can see that it warps the entire result and you get some really strange effects. Now, depending on what you're doing, this might actually be really useful, but for us, we want it between the grid so that it's only warping the grid itself. So, we're going to now embed this back into our main composite. So let's switch back to that, find our grid layer comp, and then drop that in to here. And there we go, we have a nice grid working on top of our footage. We're actually going to change the blend method to add. Gives it slightly more of a glowing look. And of course we don't want it appearing for the entire duration. We just want it to appear as I fade out. So this is where I'm fading out. and will have the grid move across me. So let's turn it on, and we'll take a square mask again, and let's draw it down here. As you can see, we can't see the grid at all, but if we go in and animate the path, so as I turn invisible we actually move the mask along. We'll just switch back to the select tool and then move this mask so it drags along here. You can see it gradually reveals the grid, and we'll move it all the way to the other side. Now as we animate between the two, this shape will move, revealing the grid just for a moment. Now we don't want it to have that hard edge, so we'll just increase the feather a little bit so that you can't tell where the edge of the mask is. So next up we want to create a glow just as I start to turn invisible. So to do this, let's just collapse these layers down. We're going to take our displacement source layer again, add it on top, and we'll call this the glow layer. And in here we want to add some neon glow effects. So that's not exactly the look we're going for straight off, of course, so let's do some customization as we did before. We'll go for a yellow look here, and then we'll actually duplicate that, and on the second one change it to more of a darker orange. Okay, now we don't actually want the original showing through here, so we're going to change this to none, and then on this one we'll change it to add, so that will give it more intensity. We actually want to just drop the expansion on this particular one down a little so that the edge is a little closer into the original. Okay, now of course again we don't want this showing up for the whole video because that would look a little bit weird, so let's go into transform and we'll set the opacity to 0, move forward a few frames and raise it back up to 100. Move forward again a little way, drop it down to 0, and you'll now see that we've got a sudden explosion of glow just as the grid starts to move across, and then it fades out just in time to see the invisible version. Obviously the timings of all these bits and pieces can be tweaked depending on what kind of effect you're going for. Okay, so currently the fade out of the glow is a little bit uniform. It just fades straight out like that. What would be nice is if it kind of lingers around some of the details here. So to do this, we're going to create a new comp. We're going to call this the glow disperse layer. And into this we shall drag our good old displacement source, which as you might have noticed is being the source for pretty much everything we're doing here. Now onto this we're going to add a find edges effect. As you can see, this is quite an extreme effect, and you have to be quite careful when you use it because it won't always be particularly useful, but in this particular case it's exactly what we need. So we don't actually want this slight bit of colour that's creeping in here, so let's add on a hue, saturation and lightness filter, go into the master settings, and we'll actually drop the saturation all the way down, so we've now got a nice black and white result. Finally we shall take the crush blacks and whites effect, and we want to boost up the whites so that they're nice and visible. And we'll actually drop the blacks down so that we're just left with that kind of highlight detail there. Something a little bit like that. Okay, back to our main comp, and we want to find that composite shot we just created, the glow disperse layer, add that on. Okay, that's not exactly what we're going for, so what we shall do is change this to an add composite so that you can see we've just got the lines going on here, but of course it's not actually the right kind of colours or anything. So let's take the colour correction wheels, add that onto the comp, and we want to change it all to push towards the yellow. Okay, that's kind of blending in more with the grid look. Of course we don't want it to be quite as defined as this, so we'll take a diffuse filter, add that on. Gives it a slightly softer look, but let's boost it up a bit more. So increase the radius, and we want to boost up the opacity a little bit so you can see what's going on. Okay, Let's just zoom in here. Or maybe drop that down just a little bit. Put that down to about 50. Okay, so if I just turn this off for a second, you can see the difference that it's making. Just around those highlights, you're getting a bit more detail coming in. Finally, we'll take an exposure, drop that on afterwards, and we want to find the point where the effect begins to happen. So we'll go for the peak of this, and we'll actually boost up the exposure massively. And we actually want to activate keyframing for this as well. Move through to the end of the invisibility and then drop it all the way down. Okay. You can now see that we've got this nice highlighting going on, and as everything fades out, we still have a little bit of highlighting on some of those elements. Of course, we don't want it appearing over the top like this. So if we just collapse this down, we can drag this underneath the glow layer so that the glow layer takes priority. And of course, we don't want these highlights appearing for the entire effect, although that does look kind of cool. So to stop that, we'll just go and find where the peak of the glow is, around about there, and then we'll just crop the glow disperse layer so that it only appears at that point. Now as we scrub through, you can see the effects all kick in at the right points to create the gradual invisibility with the grid and the glows and all sorts. The interaction of different layers is what makes an effect convincing. Okay, so that was a pretty epic tutorial. I hope you managed to follow all the way to the end. If you did, we expect to see some cool invisibility videos coming from you guys. If you upload them through the software, make sure you select the broadcast option so that we get to see them as well. Those of us in Europe are still waiting for Deus Ex Human Revolution to come out, unlike you lucky Americans who got it at the start of the week. But either way, hopefully this will give you a good head start at making some cool Deus Ex fan films. Thanks for watching. We're bringing out these tutorials all the time, so if you like this kind of content, please do subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video.